Well, we want to welcome you again to another live stream episode here for Determined Truth. We're continuing our conversation on Israel, Gaza, and what's been going on. My name is Rev Dr Mae, and I'm the director of Determined Truth. And we want to thank you for joining us here. In a few minutes, I'm going to have three leading voices come on one at a time who will join me in this conversation. But I'd like to begin kind of by framing the conversation, if I can. I kind of like to frame the conversation with maybe three things and 3 points in mind. First off, I think we need to understand that even though the formal assault on Gaza has ended, we just have to continue to weep with those who weep, with all those who have suffered, whether Palestinians, Israelis. You've seen the pictures recently of tens of thousands of Gazans who are returning home. But when they get home, the question is going to be, what are they going to find? I'd like to actually share my screen here for a second and read to you. I got to do this. Let's see, present here. And then share screen. Something that one of our guests is going to have posted on Facebook a little while ago. And here's what he said. He said, I want to celebrate the ceasefire. This is Daniel Bannoura. I want to celebrate the ceasefire, but I can't. I'm glad that my friends in Gaza can take a breath and collect what remains of their lives, but I continue to mourn the friends that I've lost and the thousands of beautiful souls that were robbed from us. I can't celebrate because the genocide isn't over. It's marked on the bodies and souls of every Palestinian. There are no schools or universities in Gaza, no functioning health system, no homes to go back to. Bodies are still decomposing under the rubble and unaccounted for. Many more will die in the coming days and months from physical and psychological ailments caused by this genocide. The trauma and grief will linger on for generations. Mothers and fathers and children will continue to weep for the ones they've lost. There's a ceasefire, but the occupation isn't over. Apartheid isn't over. Systemic oppression isn't over. The constant dehumanization of the Palestinians over 77 years isn't over. We gather what remains of our souls and bodies, what remains of our homeland and humanity. We hope, we pray, we persist. We continue to fight for justice and liberation. So I just want to begin with that and simply say, our first thing is that we have to understand that there's a lot of trauma that's going on here and that has taken place. The second thing I want to point out is that the conditions in the West Bank are horrific. So yeah, the assault on Gaza has ended and it gives us something to celebrate, but the conditions in Gaza and in the West Bank are just unbelievable. So in the West Bank, settler violence has increased exponentially. If you'll go to the Determined Truth YouTube page, and I encourage you to subscribe to that page, then you'll automatically be notified of upcoming live streams. But we did a live stream on October 7th of 2024, 1 year later. I think it was titled 1 year later. Another one named Under Siege with Mercy Aiken. So two different live streams discussing what's actually happening a year later. That's only 2 or 3 months ago. There are 898 new military checkpoints that have been installed throughout the West Bank in the last month, I think since the ceasefire. We cannot imagine what this does to the human psyche. There's no freedom. They're imprisoned in their own cities and villages. Kids can't go to school. It stifles the economy. One reporter in Gaza said, quote, you can't imagine the difficulty of the situation here. So the psychological and emotional toll of this war, to say nothing of the fact that this is the fourth war in the last 20 years in Gaza, will impact the Palestinians for generations, and even to some effect the Israelis. But what's happened in Gaza especially, and even in the West Bank. So this is not to deny, again, that there's been suffering among the Israelis, but what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza is unbelievably horrific. So an op-ed in the EU Observer said, quote, the current reality in the West Bank may be the worst since decades, and it's reflected on the lockdown imposed over all Palestinian cities and the increasing number of Israeli settler attacks. So since January, Israeli forces have killed 34 Palestinians, including 6 children in the West Bank. This includes 12 Palestinians have been killed since the onset of the Israeli forces in their operation in Jenin City in the camp on the 21st of January, less than a week, or actually I think a week ago. Secondly, there's been a surge in Israeli settler attacks against Palestinians. So again, settlers are Israeli citizens who live in the West Bank territories. And they've been unleashed since the current regime took place with Netanyahu, and especially since the assault on Gaza took place, knowing that they can really do whatever they want to do in many ways without any repercussions because the attention of the world is on Gaza and not on the West Bank. So result of injuries and damage to houses and vehicles over the last week. 17 Palestinians have reported injuries. The severe movement of restrictions, as I mentioned already, 898 checkpoints and 89 road closures in Bethlehem alone. Prolonged delays at these checkpoints, installation of new gates at village entrances. All this is impeding Palestinian access to basic services and workplaces. Access to healthcare in the West Bank is deteriorating due to the fiscal crisis and movement of restrictions, with 68% of the health service points now unable to function more than 2 or 3 days a week, and hospitals that are functioning are only functioning at 70% of their capacity. And then, as I mentioned previously, that on the 21st of January, the Israeli military announced the beginning of an Operation, quote, Iron Wall in Jenin, in the Jenin refugee camp, which is in the heart of the West Bank up in the northern part, which includes helicopter gunfire and airstrikes alongside ground forces. Multiple airstrikes have carried out on Jenin city, on the refugee camp and nearby locations. The Ministry of Health has confirmed that 12 Palestinians were killed and at least 50 others have been injured in the last 7 days. Now, some might respond to this by saying, well, Israel has to do this for their own security. And my response to that would be, look, violence begets violence. Jesus himself said, as we've said many times on these live streams, that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that unless Israel changes its policies and its endeavors to work towards a just peace, they're always going to be met with violence. And this is not to justify the violence on the part of the Palestinians. It's simply an appeal to ending the violence. So I'm going to have a live stream on Saturday. And I encourage you to go to the Determined Truth homepage. And if you go to the homepage there and then click on the events tab. And if you click on the events tab and scroll down, the second one there is going to be an interview with Usama Nicola. And Usama is going to come on with me on Saturday. It's going to be a live event only. It will not be recorded, and it will be on Zoom. So the Zoom link is there on my website. And Usama told me the other day, he said, Rob, thanks so much for reaching out and what you're doing for our community. I'm glad to hear about the live stream that we're going to be hosting, which he's talking about today's live stream. He says, but while a ceasefire might end active fighting, the systemic oppression, restrictions, and harsh conditions for Palestinians remain, especially the continued closures, checkpoints, and settler violence. Currently in Bethlehem, he says, and the surrounding areas, most gates remain closed, and the few that are open are heavily guarded by soldiers. Movement is incredibly restricted, impacting access to work, healthcare, and basic necessities. Families are struggling to make ends meet under these conditions, and the psychological toll is immense. If there's a specific, and then he goes on to say, let me know if he can help in any way further as well. So the third point I'm going to make here really quickly before my first guest comes on is this. Again, although the formal assault on Gaza has ended and the conditions of life in Gaza and the West Bank are severely worsened, in fact, the conditions that led to the October 7th uprising are actually worse today than they were before October 7th. So in other words, what's to stop another uprising from happening? Now, you might try to say, and I hope you don't say this, well, if they revolt again, they're going to be punished again. And this time even worse, because Israel has to defend itself. But what if we could stop the violence by providing a justice for everyone? Isn't this what Jesus calls us to work towards when he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, which the word righteousness means justice, as it's translated in the New Living Translation even. We've all heard the arguments. Hamas must be defeated and destroyed. Jonathan Kuttab, who come on with me in just a little bit, said over a year ago on one of our live streams that you cannot defeat an ideology. Hamas is an ideology, and you can't defeat it. In fact, Hamas is by all measures stronger today than it was before October 7th, 2023. They now have 15,000 orphans that they can recruit from. There's 100,000 wounded and 45,000 that are dead. Those survivors are going to be easily recruited. And I just think that this is a tenuous solution at best. And I've got three experts that are going to come on. Let me introduce my first one here to talk a little bit more about the ceasefire and what they think and what their thoughts are. My first guest is going to be Daniel Bannoura. Oh, let me see if I can get that here. So Daniel, welcome to the stage here. Let me put you on this way. Daniel is a Palestinian theologian and a PhD candidate in Quranic studies at the University of Notre Dame. His research focuses on redaction of the Quran, Syriac and late antiquity, Christian-Muslim relations, and Palestinian theology. Daniel is a member of the organizing committee of the Christ at the Checkpoint conferences. He's also a co-host of the podcast Across the Divide, which provides a space for thoughtful conversations about Palestine, Israel, through the lens of faith and peacemaking. Daniel, welcome.
Thanks, Rob. It's good to be with you.
I appreciate it. So, Daniel, let me just kind of begin by giving you the opportunity to kind of give your thoughts with respect to the ceasefire, the tragedy that's occurred in Gaza, and the increase in terror and kind of in the West Bank in general. So, just kind of where are you at with all this? I read obviously your Facebook post. If you, I think you might have been listening in at that point in time as well.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Rob. I think there's a bit of a naivete now that people think that, okay, the war's over, let's move on. Trump, made peace in the Middle East, and now it's over. Now things are back to normal. People can get on with their lives, but the situation was never normal before October 7 or since then. And like you have said, and that you have shown in the introduction here, the situation is worse in the West Bank. And I think the Israeli military had said this also. People from the military have said, now we can focus on the West Bank. Now we can focus on the people there. And then we're seeing what that's doing: the killing of the Palestinians, the restriction of movement, the destruction of the Jenin refugee camp, and killing of people. Children are being killed left and right. I saw a news report of a family that was having dinner last night, and the IDF shot at the family and killed a 2-year-old baby while they were having dinner. So yeah, nothing has changed. The same ideology, the same system of violence and oppression and dehumanization of the Palestinians continue unabated, and uncritically supported by the U.S. There's nothing that is, in the imagination of those in the West, there's nothing wrong that is happening right now. The Palestinians continue to be dehumanized. And yeah, like you said, you mentioned Hamas and the ideology of Hamas. We have to understand that a people's desire for freedom can never be underestimated. Right. People's response to injustice is a very natural and expected thing. So whether it's in the Gaza, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Palestinians in the West Bank, whether it's anyone else, the system of oppression is always going to lead to resistance, and that's going to continue. And yeah, so there's this kind of naive optimism that people have had since the ceasefire happened, was signed and agreed upon. But yeah, we have to adopt a more critical analysis of the systems of power of the occupation. The occupation hasn't stopped. It's more entrenched now. The devastation in Gaza, God only knows what kind of long-term effect that's going to have on the people there, on their psyche, on like you said, on even the militarization of folks moving forward, and the radicalization of many orphans right now. Many people who left their siblings, their parents, their children. Why wouldn't these people be radicalized and join a resistance movement? And even if they're not radicalized, just a sense of duty to avenge their loved ones, to fight for freedom. So yeah, it's not really looking good, and it's like, I think many people think, okay, I'm off the hook now. It's over. I don't have to do anything anymore. I'm like, no, you're not off the hook. It's still happening, and we have to keep fighting for justice for the Palestinians.
Right. Do you have any other specific updates on Gaza, the West Bank, of things that I haven't covered or things that you have already addressed? Anything that you know of, other than, like, you mentioned the 2-year-old child shot having dinner last night, but any information that you might have in particular that you want to add?
Nothing really specific. I think you mentioned the checkpoints and the blockade in the West Bank right now. My family is stuck in Bethlehem. They cannot leave Bethlehem area. My family lives in a small village by Bethlehem, and the 3 exits and entrances of that village have been shut down. So they're kind of stuck in their homes right now. So yeah, the West Bank right now is like a big prison, with kind of pockets of prisons all over the West Bank, and people are stuck.
And that means, Daniel, that they're then access to food, access to anything, let alone community, is going to be severely hindered.
Not yet. I think they're still letting food coming through. So you're stuck in your enclave. There are food and resources coming in and out, but you cannot leave the enclave. I haven't heard anything about any shortage right now, but who knows? I mean, they could easily, shut the faucet. They can shut the roads, and anything will happen. It's collective punishment. I mean, and Palestinians have been dealing with this system of collective punishment since the occupation began.
Mm-hmm.
So from 1967, and then you can even take it back to 1948 and the occupation of the Palestinians inside the forested Israel. So this is the same system of control and divide and conquer that has always been operative in the West Bank and Gaza.
Okay, all right. Let me ask you this then. one of the things that has happened for the last number of years that we've been addressing this issue is the fact that you kind of have this multiple narratives, especially two narratives, and then with each narrative, obviously, multiple narratives within them. One is this Israeli narrative of existential threat, existential danger, anti-Semitism, Iranian threat. The Palestinians want to destroy them. Hamas wants them off the map. You can't negotiate with terrorists. Hamas won't negotiate. And then you have the Palestinian narrative of oppression, loss of land, 750,000 people in 1948, and the oppression of the occupation. And it seems that these dueling narratives are simply just, there's no way to bring them together. But it seems that this war in particular, Daniel, has really reinforced the fact that Israel seems to have a program, a plan of ethnic cleansing, that they seem to really want to get rid of the Palestinians. And so when you look at the ceasefire now, and you look at the tens of thousands that are trying to head north to go back home, what are they going home to? I mean, how can they actually rebuild this? I mean, you're talking about billions of dollars and 80 years, it says, to rebuild this. How can the Palestinians rebuild this under the fact that they still remain in this enclave without any ability to have access to the outside world?
Yeah, I mean, it's very scary to think about the prospect of the future, of what's going to happen. I mean, you saw this from Trump recently. He's saying, "Hey, Jordan and Egypt, you should take Palestinians out." This is the same rhetoric of the settler movement in Israel. This is the rhetoric of the Israeli government, the right-wing fascist government you have in Israel, and this is also the rhetoric of the Christian Zionists that he put in power right now. For example, Mike Huckabee, when he was running for office like 10 years ago or so, he said the same thing. Palestinians should go to Jordan. Palestinians should go to Egypt. So this is the same rhetoric that's been adopted by right-wing Christian Zionists like Mike Huckabee and the different folks that Marco Rubio is also one of those people who also deny the Palestinian as a people. And he's the Secretary of State right now. How does that affect American foreign policy? So you have these Christian Zionists in the Trump administration that deny the humanity and the rights, the international law, the UN resolutions that protect Palestinians, and are following an agenda of ethnic cleansing, like you said, and of wholesale destruction of the Palestinians. This is what genocide is, the wholesale destruction of the Palestinian people. And now these right-wing Christian Zionists are in power, not to excuse whatever Biden did in his own administration, but now this is a very scary prospect now that you have at least some right-wing Christians in cahoots with right-wing Jewish Zionists in Israel, and the devastation that could ensue based on the policies of this current administration is unfathomable. Like, it's going to be complete. It has a potential of destroying the whole of the Palestinian people. If you're talking about moving 1 million or so people from Gaza, if you're talking about what's happening in the West Bank, the confiscation of lands and the pushing of the Palestinians into open air prisons right now in the West Bank, this could have a very severe impact on the Palestinian people. And also, you have to realize, because of your audience, Rob, this is done by evangelicals, by right-wing conservative Christians. This is ideology of Mike Huckabee, Marco Rubio, who are these conservative Christian Zionists. Right. So the church was never off the hook in the last 15 years of its silence and its complicity. But now the Christians who voted overwhelmingly for Trump are now complicit in the actions and the policies of this conservative right-wing government that is managed and propelled by Christian Zionist ideology.
Yeah, and that almost took one of the questions I was going to ask you in terms of, do anything that you think the church needs to know and its complicity in this with regards to this. Now, this might be a redundant a little bit, but because I think we're already touching on this, and we're going to touch on some of the things that you just mentioned with some of the other guests coming up, by the way. And if you're watching us live, go ahead and feel free to put some comments in the comments box, maybe at the end, or I have kind of in the home run slot, Dr. Mae Cannon. So maybe we'll have some questions and time with her if we have time at the end of this. But are you concerned, Daniel, that the situation that led to October 7th, 2023 is actually worse now, and therefore you're only planting the seeds for another uprising? Or, I mean, where do we go from here, I guess, is the ultimate question.
I don't think we should expect an uprising from the Palestinians anytime
Right.
soon. I mean, militant groups are going to have to recuperate and organize themselves, and probably a lot of their weapons depots have been destroyed. So who knows what? I'm not expecting an uprising anytime soon, but it's not about an uprising. It's not about what Palestinians do in response to their oppression. It's about, I think for now, we need to pay attention to the wholesale destruction of the Palestinians. It seems
Okay.
that this war, this idea we need to destroy Hamas and therefore destroy Gaza, uh, is not about Palestinian militancy and war per se. It's going beyond that into a project that began in the early 20th century of emptying Palestine of its population. And that began in 1948 and is continuing today. And we're seeing when you destroy a whole region like the Gaza Strip, like you're saying, where are they going to go? Many of them are going to say, if they're going to be pushed out, they might be pushed out into Egypt and be emptied out of the land. So, Israeli militarism, a system of violence and domination, is going to continue because that's how Israel functions on oppression and violence and war. Um, Palestinian resilience is going to always be there, but I'm more worried about long-term drastic impact on the populations and
Right.
on the future of what we have naively understood to be a two-state solution. I think the Israeli government now, with the current American administration, has shown its kind of ugly face, and it's not trying to hide the reality. It's not trying to hide what we Palestinians have been saying for a very long time, that the end goal of Israel is the complete domination of the Palestinian people.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, when it comes to militancy, when it comes to how what seeds are being sown right now, we can easily say that the kids who are orphans today are going to be the militants in 10,
Right.
20 years from now. So who knows? So it is possible that we can find another uprising would come in 10, 15, 20 years. Who knows? But fundamentally, this has to be addressed as a system of justice and an
Yeah.
issue of human rights and international law. And if we keep dilly-dallying and distracting ourselves thinking about Iran or thinking about Hamas, we're missing the point. Are we pursuing truth? Are we pursuing peace? Or are we pursuing the normalization of oppression? And I think for many people, especially Christians who are naive or ignorant or apathetic, they have fallen into this trap talking about militant Islam, and they have ignored the reality on the ground, which is the occupation and the
Right.
system of apartheid that exists in Palestine.
Yeah. Yeah. The things that sow the seeds for that militancy. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. So, and again, we're not denying the issue of Israel and the Jewish people having existential concerns and legitimate security needs. But what we're simply saying is the narrative, as it's simply playing out, is showing that actually it doesn't seem like Israel is a partner in peace at all. And their whole agenda has been the annihilation and ethnic cleansing of the
Yeah,
Palestinian people.
but Rob, we need to interrogate this idea that Israel has security needs.
Okay.
What are these security needs? The security needs mean that you're going to oppress the Palestinians and oppress them in such a way that Palestinians would fight back. Like, why do you
Right.
think that your security has to come at the expense of the Palestinians? Why do you think this is okay? Like, you've always going to have a security concern as long as you oppress people, and this is the idea
Exactly.
that Israelis can never be free, can never have security at the expense of the Palestinians. So the
Yeah.
whole system of Israel has to protect its civilians. It's nonsense. That's not that. I wish that was true, but if you want the security of your people, then the first thing you would do is to ensure there is justice in the land. But if security means oppression, that's not security. That's just an
Yeah. Right.
excuse for oppression. You just make up any excuse to justify the violence against the Palestinian people. So you can say, yeah, security of my people is my concern, therefore I'm going to oppress others. But
Exactly, and I hope I was clear. That's what I was trying to get at. Actually, you get these
yeah,
dueling narratives, and this one narrative of okay, we have this existential threat. Okay, sure, you have
yeah,
legitimate security needs, but are your security needs the result of oppression?
right, exactly,
And it might
exactly.
be more complex than that, but is it the result of complexion? Yeah.
Yeah, I think my point was this idea of like uncompatible narratives, unintentionally perhaps, or maybe intentionally for some people, attempt to obfuscate and create confusion. It's like, oh, well, they cannot agree. Well, things are never going to get better until Christ comes back. There's a kind of this kind of nihilistic idea. There is no way you can reconcile them. And that's why you have to kind of unpack and interrogate this idea of two sides and say, no, there's only one side. There's a side of oppression, and that side has to be dismantled. And whenever oppression stops, like slavery in the US, in the South, just like apartheid in South Africa. Once that is taken care of, now you can talk about security and peace and reconciliation. But until the system of oppression is over, any excuse to maintain the system of oppression should not be tolerated.
Hey, I want to thank you so much. I want to respect your time. I know you have a dissertation to work on. You got some deadlines coming up. So thank you so much, Daniel, for being with us today.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you.
Take care. Right. Take care. All right. My next guest is Jonathan Kuttab. Jonathan is the director of Friends of Sabeel, North America. Jonathan's a co-founder of the Palestinian human rights group Al-Haq, as well as Nonviolence International. He's a well-known international human rights attorney. He practices in the United States, Palestine, and in Israel. He serves on the board of Bethlehem Bible College and is the president of the board of Holy Land Trust. Jonathan was the head of the legal committee negotiating the Cairo Agreement in 1994 between Israel and the PLO. After graduating with a doctor of jurisprudence from Virginia Law School and practicing a couple of years on Wall Street, Jonathan returned home to Palestine. He's a resident of East Jerusalem and a partner of Kuttab, Curry, and Hanna law firm in East Jerusalem. He's also the author of Beyond the Two-State Solution, which suggests that any solution must be predicated on the basic existential needs of the two parties. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you, and thanks to all your listeners.
All right. So, Jonathan, let me kind of begin in the same way that I did with Daniel and simply ask you the question, anything, your thoughts with respect to the ceasefire as a whole, the tragedy that's occurred in Gaza, and maybe even the increase in terror in the West Bank.
Well, I think the ceasefire and the hostage agreement has been a very positive thing, both in the short term and in the long term. In the short term, while it doesn't address all the needs, of course, it's the cessation of a continual daily bombing. Every day, 50, 60, 70 people were killed.
Right.
It's a opening for a flood of trucks of food. Gaza needs about 500 trucks a day. They were down to almost nothing. Now there's a surge of food to prevent the starvation, particularly in the northern Gaza. That's a wonderful thing. The release of prisoners on both sides, the hostages and the prisoners, is a tremendous blessing, to the families. But so on the short term, it's a wonderful thing. We cannot but be happy that this has taken place. In the long term, it hasn't really solved the problem, but it does point to some strategic advances that have taken place to allow the people, almost 1 million people, to go back to the northern Gaza, even though they're going back to utter ruins. Their homes are ruins. There is no sewage system. There is no health system. All the schools have been destroyed. All the economy has been destroyed. Just rubble. But the fact that they are allowed back in takes away the fear of a strategic emptying of Palestine, of ethnic cleansing. The threat is still there, Even President Trump is talking about we must get these peoples out, clean them out,
right?
Send 1.5 million people to Egypt and Jordan. So there's still talk about it, but strategically it has failed. Strategically, by allowing the Palestinians back into northern Gaza, it's another way of saying we can't get rid of the Palestinians, we must deal with them. I'm not a a particular friend of or apologist for Hamas. But the fact that they have survived after all this bombardment, according to the CIA, they have recruited another 15,000 fighters, and they have trained them. It shows that you cannot defeat an ideology like Hamas. You must deal with it. You must change them into a political party. You must give them a sense of participation. You must have elections. You must have self-determination. You must have justice. You cannot just bomb them out of existence. Although Israel has tried massively to do it, they have failed. The Hamas has survived even as a fighting force. It has survived even though it's been weakened. My point is not, again, to glorify in any way Hamas, but to say what we've been saying from day one. Violence is not the answer.
Right.
Violence does not give the Israelis security, and it does not give the Palestinians liberation. Violence is not the answer. We must seek a different way of resolving our problems.
All right. Now, Jonathan, thank you. Now, I know you're a legal expert. I'm not sure how familiar you are with what's going on today and on the ground there, but this agreement, this ceasefire, is almost the exact same ceasefire verbatim that was agreed to by Hamas back in May of 2024. So why do you think all of a sudden now Netanyahu changed his mind? I mean, I know we're all hearing some things. I don't know if you're hearing anything more than what the rest of us are hearing. Probably.
Well, he did not change his mind. I think he would have loved to have this continue forever and ever.
Right.
A number of things have changed. One of them is that the United States, for once, made it clear that they wanted it to stop. I mean, all Trump had to do is say, look, I want this to stop. I want this to stop before my inauguration.
Right.
For whatever reason, maybe it's because of he wants to make a deal with Saudi Arabia, maybe because he wants to show that he is in favor of ending war rather than perpetuating. For whatever reason, all the United States has to do is stop. And it does stop. Because Israel cannot continue this type of genocide without U.S. participation, without U.S. permission, without a U.S. Diplomatic umbrella to prevent the United Nations or the international community from putting an end to genocide. So the United States is powerful. It is a participant in this operation. And it has shown that when it says stop it, it stops.
Right.
When it says do the deal, they do the deal. The deal was there all along.
Right.
As you say, from May, almost nothing changed other than the United States finally decided to put its foot down.
Now, do you think, however, though, so one of the things that Hamas has had in this whole conflict is that the leverage of the hostages, which I think, it seems to be that Netanyahu hasn't been too concerned personally about the hostages, even though the people of Israel clearly are. He hasn't made a great effort, apparently, to get them out. But once the hostages are returned, and I know some are going to be returned in phase 1, some are in phase 2, some in phase 3. But now there's almost nothing holding Israel back from going back and doing what they did before, so what are your thoughts on the long-term ability for the ceasefire to actually be a lasting ceasefire and maybe ultimately bring about a just resolution?
Well, clearly there isn't. In fact, we don't even have a mechanism to ensure movement from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. The problem remains and it needs to be addressed. And as the previous speaker said, we need to end the occupation. We need to end the injustice. We need to end apartheid. We need to end any system that's based totally on sheer power, one side physically imposing its will on others. But I may not be very optimistic about the short-term things, but I am full of hope.
Okay.
And part of it has to do with my faith.
Okay.
I believe in the sovereignty of God. I believe that evil cannot prevail forever. I believe that injustice and oppression and tyranny carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Ultimately, people can and should live together. The default position is not one of fighting and killing and injustice. The default position is in favor of peace, in favor of people getting along. Of course, we see the violence of the moment. What we don't see is the history of peaceful cooperation. People don't realize, say, oh, they've been fighting forever. Not true. For
Right.
almost 13 centuries, since the Crusades until this past century, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together in Palestine, in the Holy Land.
Let me push back on you a little bit on that, Jonathan, just for a second here, because I understand where you're coming from. And I think it's amazing when I hear a Palestinian say that they have hope. But what we see happen is, you just look at the American situation, what we did to the Native Americans. And the answer is, there were plenty of Native Americans that got along with the U.S. Peoples and peacefully coexisted. But at the end of the day, they ended up being slaughtered. You look at Aborigines in Australia, they end up being slaughtered. It seems right now that there's almost, I know it's important to have hope, but I don't see the political, social, economic, societal systems in place that give any real reason for hope for the Palestinians that there's a solution out of this.
Well, I think we need to recognize that the world has changed since the time of, since World War II. At the end of World War II, people got together and says, this is getting to be terrible. We cannot live in a world without rules. Violence is becoming so endemic and weapons are becoming so destructive. We need to have a system. So the United Nations, the conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the system of international governance that was set up since World War II has pretty much worked correctly. There are a few exceptions. There's 4 or 5 cases only of states capturing or trying to take over the land of their neighbors. 5 cases only since World War II. One of them was Iraq trying to take over Kuwait. One of them was Russia taking over the Ukraine. One of them was Morocco taking over Western Sahara. And one of them was Israel taking over the West Bank and the Golan. And so there's only been a handful of cases. Most countries have found a way through the international system to more or less live together or find different solutions other than trying to forcibly take over your neighbor's land because you need it, because you want it, because you have security interests.
We could have a really long conversation on this, Jonathan. We got 1 more minute with you left, but because I wonder if, as I smirk a little bit, if what's not being included in those 5 cases are all the instances where the United States has manipulated regime change in various countries. In other words, we didn't take over the countries. We just made sure that those countries manipulated our purpose. International law works, and you're obviously an international lawyer, so I'm not the one to be speaking here. It works when the players follow the rules and are willing to follow the rules. And the United States obviously has been a main instigator of not being willing to follow the rules. And I think Israel-Gaza is the key instance of that. All right, 30 seconds left, Jonathan. Anything that you want to add here before we bring on our next guest?
Yeah. The United States used to be a leader in the international community in keeping international law. Okay. Recently, it has refused to do so In fact, it has fought international law. I
Yeah.
like to think that international law is a blessing. It's not perfect. It needs work. But it's a blessing for people to think of other ways to resolve their differences rather than by fighting and killing.
Yeah. Jonathan, thank you so much again for joining us. This is, I think, your third or fourth time that you've been on our live streams, and you're such a valuable resource for us. I really appreciate this, and we'll just continue to have this conversation more as we go. So thank you so much, brother.
Thank you, and thanks to all your audience for listening, because you introduce a different way of looking at things than the one they usually get from the mainstream media in this country.
All right. Thanks, Jonathan. All right. My final guest here is batting cleanup for us today. As many of you have gotten to know Rev Dr Mae Cannon. Mae is the executive director for Churches for Middle East Peace. She's an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. She holds an MDiv from North Park Theological Seminary, an MBA from, and I have a dog with an anxiety disorder behind me. Can you hear her, Mae? Yes, so I might have to take care of that dog with her anxiety disorder. She wants to be with me, but that doesn't always work out. So I'm poor decision making on my part prior to this. So, but anyways, she has an MBA from North Park University School of Business and Nonprofit Management, an MA in Bioethics from Trinity International University. She has a number of doctorates. So I won't go through all of this. She's also the author of several books, including the award-winning Social Justice Handbook. And I think that's how you and I first got to meet each other when we were introduced there. But she has another book called Small Steps for a Better World, and she's the editor of A Land Full of God, Christian Perspectives on the Holy Land. Her work has been highlighted in the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Chicago Tribune, Christianity Today, Leadership Magazine, Christian Post, Jerusalem Post, EU Parliament Magazine, Huffington Post, and other international media outlets. I need to breathe. Welcome, Mae.
Thanks, Rob. That first book you just mentioned came out in 2009. So that means we've known one another a really, really long time.
That's right. It's just a couple of years. So that's right. So, and I'm glad it's been a wonderful friendship. I thank you so much for it. So let me begin by allowing you just kind of same question I asked Jonathan and Daniel. I know you were listening in. Give your thoughts with respect to the ceasefire, the tragedy that's occurred in Gaza, and the increased terror in the West Bank. I can hear you. I'm going to take care of the little mutt behind me. So go ahead.
I have two Great Danes and a poodle.
I know you do. I knew you would understand more than
My
anybody.
husband's out of town, so
all right, great.
Yeah, no, I'll start with that. Thank you, and what a privilege, of course, to speak after Daniel and Jonathan, such esteemed leaders. Palestinian Christians, it's a great privilege. So the question of anything I missed, thank you for highlighting what's happening in the West Bank. I mean, it's literally being called the silent war. And it was going on, the death toll in the occupied West Bank was the highest that it's been since the Second Intifada in the beginning of the early 2000s last year. And I didn't have some of the statistics you shared today. So thank you for highlighting that. I think also just emphasizing, and I believe Jonathan mentioned this, and you've talked about it a little bit already, but the role that the U.S. plays, we would not be here today if the U.S. had, I would say, done what is right, but had the Biden administration had a stronger hand, we would not be where we are today. And so some of it has to do with poor political leadership, et cetera, but some of it has to do with the U.S. is not only complicit, it is participatory in terms of what is happening towards the Palestinians. And specifically, I mean, because of the provision of weapons. Even Jewish groups that identify themselves as pro-Israel, like J Street, are calling for the withholding of limited weapons, not defensive weapons, but certain types of weapons. And we've already seen in the first week of the Trump administration the expectation that 2,000-pound bombs will be once again sent to Israel, and you may also, of course, be following the details that the Trump administration has put a hold on foreign aid and assistance, which has included everyone but Egypt and Israel. And so there's some question that might be, a hold on Jordan's foreign aid to pressure them to take Palestinians, based on this resettlement conversation that Trump has been having this week. So just had Biden been a stronger leader, we wouldn't be where we are today. And that's putting it kindly. I mean, his nickname was Genocide Joe, and many people would argue that what has happened in Israel and in Gaza is why the Democrats lost the election. And I'm not saying that from any particular political vantage point. I'm just saying that as, analyzing. I think then the final thing is just, where do we go from here? And, one of the things that I've been doing is still daily. Today is, I'll tell you exactly what today is. Today is day 480 since October 7th of 2023. And so every single day I've been summarizing the news from various different media sources. And what we're hearing, like what Trump says, but what the Trump administration is doing, there's inconsistency. So Trump, President Trump said on the day of the inauguration, he wasn't sure that this ceasefire would continue. And that aspect of how tenuous it is, I think most people have no idea how tenuous it is. But President Trump saying he didn't know if he had confidence that it was being, going to be implemented, but yet his Middle East envoy is on the ground this week in Israel and is like literally taking a very, very hands-on approach to ensuring that the ceasefire is implemented. And so that's Steve Witkoff. And so like what you hear versus like what's happening, there's a word for that. They sometimes call it reindeer games. If you've ever read any of those like novels, the idea that publicly what's communicated versus what's happening privately. Now that says nothing about intentionality and where we're headed, but I think it's just really important to acknowledge those dynamics, if you will.
May, how can people follow your live updates? Is that just permanently on your Facebook feed or Christians for Middle East Peace?
We put it everywhere. I mean, it's on CMEP's Churches for Middle East Peace. It's on our YouTube page. It's on our LinkedIn, Instagram. It's on Facebook. So those, and every Thursday I do a live briefing. That's a 30-minute summary of all of the news of the week before. And those are then recorded and put online as well. So if you don't want to listen every day, because they're like 10 minutes, I mean, they're really detailed.
Yeah, they're great.
And I often can't keep them less than 10 minutes because I really am trying to do justice, if you will, to a multi-narrative approach. How's Israeli news talking about this? How's Arab news talking about this? What's happening here in the US? And now that things have expanded to Syria and Hayat Tahrir al-Shams and what's been happening in Lebanon with the break of the ceasefire there, which has now been extended to mid-February. It's not just an update on Gaza and Israel-Palestine, it's an update on the broader Middle East as well.
All right. Now, you might not have a concrete answer on this because I think what we're dealing with, of course, is personalities. We're dealing with just the great unknown of the Trump presidency and everything else. But there's been some reports that there have been some side deals that maybe Trump wanted to get this ceasefire in place simply for his inauguration to make it this great spectacle. And then basically he's behind the doors told Netanyahu, go ahead and do whatever you want after a couple of weeks. The fact that he sent 2,000-pound bombs over, he said the other day, I'm sure you heard, well, why'd you send them over? He was asking, like, well, they paid for them. It's like, really? So that, do you have any concerns from that perspective about the ceasefire lasting? Obviously, the other thing that we haven't discussed here today that you might want to add if you wish, that Netanyahu yesterday was in court for bribery and fraud charges and, giving his thumbprints and fingerprints and everything else as well. So that's a real thing that people have been saying, well, he's, his political life is on the line, that he has to keep this war going because otherwise he'll be in prison. So you want to speak to any of those complexities there about this and how it affects the ceasefire?
Sure. Well, I think what you just articulated about Netanyahu is true. There are indictments against him. Many people have asserted the reality that if he were not the prime minister, he would be much more directly, facing those challenges. Some people have asserted that he allowed October 7th, 2023 to happen in order to prevent. I mean, that's a conspiracy theory. I'm not one who adheres to that. It is true. We know that there were reports within the Israeli, this has just came out last November, but it's come out more recently since, that there were reports within the Israeli military that October 7th was going to happen that did not get passed up to Halevi and did not get, at least what's publicly communicated is that they were not aware. I think the bigger picture of what's happening now is like, what is the goal? And the goal is very clearly normalization with Saudi Arabia, that Saudi and Israel would have economic ties. Saudi Arabia has said they're not willing to do that until there is a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And there's a question of what Saudi's position is on a Palestinian state.
Right.
And so
it used to be a two-state solution was required, right, from Saudi Arabia's part.
Well, and the devil's in the details. So what's
Okay.
been articulated and what Blinken articulated before the transition was a pathway to a state. Well, there's been a pathway to I mean, that's what the Oslo Accords was meant to be. It was meant to be a pathway. And so the Palestinians have been very, very resistant. They're saying it is not, a pathway is not legitimate because a pathway allows further settlements, further expansion, further land confiscation, all those human rights abuses that you were speaking of happen while there's a pathway to a two-state solution, right? And so the question is, where is Saudi on that? And we know that the Trump administration is very, very invested in making that happen. And that the whole conversation about those international, broader Middle East dynamics directly play a part in the role that each of the countries is playing in terms of whether or not the ceasefire will continue. Because it's a precondition, and it's of course in Israel's best interest to have economic ties with Saudi Arabia and the broader Arab world as well.
Now, what do you make, if I can ask you this, with respect to the fact that Trump has made these recent statements of, well, we're going to make Jordan and Egypt take the Palestinians, and what we didn't discuss, obviously, Daniel would have been a good person to have this conversation with, but we're running out of time with him, is the inhumanity of that whole idea, right? Just people don't want to leave their homes. The fact that they're flocking back to northern Gaza is an indication of this. But what do you understand? How do you think that plays into the long-term situation for the people of Gaza, that you got the president of the United States saying we want to just allocate these people to other countries? Yeah. Feel free if you need to take a moment.
Yeah, sorry.
No, you're totally fine. You're totally
I know.
fine.
I'm like beeping puppies.
You got a dog. Yeah. So we're good. We're even now, right?
I know. So sorry.
Okay.
I think I will take a quick minute and then I'll have.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. So sorry. Hold on 1 second.
Let me go ahead while Mae's there to kind of bring that point back up and simply say, what we're talking about is the fact that oops, I got the wrong person. All right. There you go. All right. I'm playing with buttons.
Right, I'm ready. Tell me. I had the answer, but then I lost the question. Tell me again.
Okay, go ahead. So the question of Trump's statement that we're going to take the Palestinians, put them in Jordan, we're going to take them and move them to Egypt. What does that do for the long-term prospects for the people of Gaza and even the West Bank?
Sure. Well, I mean, it literally is the definition of ethnic cleansing. So let's be clear. It's illegal by international law. It also has been on the table and has been a conversation by the far right in the Israeli government. And so the question of how realistic is that being posed? There's a question that Netanyahu's political party might support that as well. They have articulated that possibility, of course, in the past. The reality is Egypt and Jordan can't afford, I mean, the morality of it is horrific. So it's wrong.
Exactly. Yeah, it's inhumane. It's absolutely inhumane.
I mean, it's inhumane. When we talk about ethnic cleansing and language like genocide, it's just now been a year since the ICC said what was happening, a year ago could have been probable genocide. And so we just came out with a number of international development agencies with a humanitarian update on what's happened in the last year since that ICC declaration. But the reality is Jordan and Egypt, their people would not allow them to accept the Palestinian people. I mean, politically, it's not even an option. So when I mentioned that Jordan, the U.S. stopped foreign assistance to Jordan, and one of the reasons could be to try to put pressure on them in this regard. But the vast majority of Jordanians, 60+%, are of Palestinian origin anyway. Even if the palace and the Jordanian government did want to, which they absolutely do not, they couldn't anyway because the people of Jordan and Egypt would not allow it to happen.
Right. We could go on for a long time, but economically, all kinds of reasons what it would do to the receiving countries. It's the same reason why we're trying to kick people out of our own country, because it has all these economic factors that are involved. So excellent. All right. Mae, anything that you want to say to the American church? I know you're an ordained minister, as myself as well. That's where our heart really is. Daniel called out the American church at the beginning. I think you heard Daniel talking about that as well. What do we need to know? What do we need to do? How do we go forward as the advocates for all this?
Well, I've been so grateful. I was listening to you and I was moved by your I'll start to cry again. Like I haven't cried enough in the last 18 months. But your introduction about what it means to be a follower of Christ in the midst of this, and how do you hold in tension? You were talking about the humanity of all people and the humanity of Israelis and of Palestinians and trauma. To talk about the trauma that is experienced by anyone who lost a loved one is not falsely equivocating about the power dynamics of what's happening. And there is very, very little room in the international sphere to have empathy and to have a multi-narrative perspective. Right. And if the church is not leading the way on break our hearts for the things that break the heart of God, exactly, and love all people, like that is one of the roles the church has to have. Right. But that's very different than what's called both sideism. It's very different than neglecting speaking truth. And, I just watched, it's a very, very progressive piece, but a criticism of Bishop Buddy, who just confronted President Trump. She was lauded by so many progressives for being so justice oriented and for having courage. She's spoken at some of our events. But there were some advocates of Palestinian human rights who've said the things she shared were easy to share. There's a genocide that's still continuing. How could she not also mention, the ongoing oppression of Palestinians or the number of people who were.
Yep. All right, we lost Mae for just a second there. Maybe I'll sing a song while we have a technical difficulty. I guess maybe those of you guys watching know better than to let me sing a song. So hopefully Mae will come back here soon. There you are. Are you back?
That usually means I'm talking too long, so it's a good pause.
You're
just catch my breath.
Because you know what? I was just going, preach it, sister. Keep preaching. Absolutely. So
just to finish, please, there's a difference between both sideism and loving all people and sharing. When we talk about when Christ says love your neighbor, let alone your enemy, that doesn't mean compromising on issues of injustice. Right. And so I was with the head of PASIA, Dr. Mae, who said, if truth is not spoken, truth will be lost. And so we can have a perspective that has empathy and that can identify, et cetera, without wavering on speaking for justice, for Palestinians and calling the realities of the oppressions that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much again for all the work that you're doing, that you continue to do, and the information that you're providing for all of us as well. I'm going to be having a series of studies. I'm going to do live streams in a couple of weeks. It's on my website as well, on the book of Revelation, because I think it just so radically speaks into this. And I really have got to say, I think the church has simply got everything upside down. We have been deceived by the devil, and we're doing the work of the devil, and we're doing the work of his kingdom and his bidding in so many ways. And I know I'm being very explicit right now, and I'm not usually that way, but I think this has to be called out. And I think the book of Revelation will put this into perspective. So I encourage you to pay attention to that. I think this goes way deeper than what we want to believe. We've grown accustomed to comfort, grown accustomed to power, all the things that Jesus says to forsake and to leave, to follow me and be my disciples. We're not weeping with those who weep. We're justifying genocide. We're justifying death, murder, violence. And this is just something that I'm worried, Mae, that you and I are going to get to the throne someday and have to, hey, what happened on your watch? And I think that's one of the things that's motivating both of us as well. So Mae, thank you so much for everything. Thank you so much for everyone that's been paying attention. You can find everything out on the Determined Truth page. We have a live stream coming up with Usama on Saturday. It's not going to be videoed, however, so you can only watch it on Zoom by clicking on the link on our website. And thank you for everything. So thanks, Mae. I appreciate it.
Good to be with you. Blessings, Rob.